Well, in the fortuitous episode runless category, you know who was a big fan of Public Enemy? Sonic
Sonic
Youth,
Youth.
especially Kim Gordon. They were so much a fan of them that Nick Sansano, the studio engineer for this album and Goo, won them over in terms of producing the album. He did not know much about Sonic Youth, right? He just knew they kind of played heavy in his mind. But he figured when he found out that they were, had a hip hop streak, especially Kim Gordon, but all of them to some degree, he showed the band members his work on two tracks: DJ Easy Rock and Rob Bass's It Takes Two, and Public Enemy's Black Steel and the Hour of Chaos, which I thought was interesting. You guys liked that one. And they were both big fans. The band in general was big fans of the album we just covered. If you're a fan of lots of Takes a Nation of Millions. Yes, sorry about that. And basically that led them to bring him in as the sound engineer. So the sound of Daydream Nation, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, plenty, was highly influenced by the sound of this era of hip hop, because that was what, Sonic Youth being a quintessentially New York band, right, is there. Yeah. But anyway, there's a fair amount to talk about. Before I get into that, in the montage, you heard Silver Rocket, and now you're going to hear a piece of total trash.
It started at the top, now it's spiraling down. What's best when it's lost, digging underground. Never mind it now, we can bring it back. It's total trash, and it's a natural fact that I'm not no cow.
Now, the song is not total trash; it's named total trash. So, along the line. So, Matt, I know historically this album has not been viewed as total trash at all in terms of the rankings.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about its spot. Mm-hmm.
You're correct. So, Daydream Nation comes in at number 8 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 1 in 1988, number 70 of all time. It is Sonic Youth's highest-rated album on Best Ever Albums. It also made Rolling Stone's list, coming in at number 171, and Sonic Youth is ranked number 55 of overall artist rankings on Best Ever Albums.
Gotcha. So we've covered Sonic Youth twice, the two albums leading up to this, EVOL and Sister, and we will cover the two albums after this, Goo and Dirty, and then we will also cover Sonic Youth currently in our run list one other time, that being in the 2000s with Rather Ripped. So we're going to be covering Sonic Youth multiple different times here, but what I'm going to attempt to do is take you up to 1988 in the Sonic Youth pantheon, because there's a lot with Sonic Youth and a lot of funny anecdotes along the way and just interesting things. So the first thing to understand about Sonic Youth is that there are 3 core members who were in the band from its inception until they broke up in 2011. And that is Thurston Moore, Kim Gordon, and Lee Ronaldo. And another thing that both led to creative elements in the band, and also, unfortunately, the band's dissolution, is the fact that Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon were married to each other, which is something that was that they basically... It
always works out.
Yeah. Well, it did for a long time until it didn't. So the origin story, though, of the band is that all of them moved to New York City right in that early 1977, mid-1977 period. So peak New York, if you will, really, at that point. And all of them have their own stories. They're musicians, but also they're art students. I think Kim Gordon would probably have called herself more of a visual art or art person than a musician at the beginning. And Thurston Moore and Lee Ronaldo, on the other hand, sort of imagine themselves as musicians first and foremost. And then there was a series of drummers that we'll talk about because there's some funny stories in there. And then this album has Steve Shelley as the drummer on it, and he would be the drummer from this album all the way until 2011. So he stays basically stationary with the band from shortly before this album until they break up in 2011. Now, they would eventually have other members added to the band at different points. I think most famously Jim O'Rourke joins the band in the early 2000s. We're going to cover one of his albums in the 90s, just as an FYI there. Solo album, totally different. But so that is the band in terms of the parts. So in this case, we'll start, though, with Thurston Moore because he kind of rounds everybody up. He's in some different bands. He begins jamming with a guy named Stanton Miranda, who has a band. They become friends, and in the band, which is named CKM, is Kim Gordon, is a member of that band. So eventually it leads to Moore and Gordon themselves forming a band. There's a bunch of different names that the band goes by, and then eventually they, in mid-1981, after sort of experimenting with stuff, they come up with the idea of the band name Sonic Youth, and they get that by combining the name of Fred Sonic Smith from what band, guys?
Parliament?
No.
Oh.
Really?
No.
Married to Patti Smith. I'd like to point that out. That's who they love, Sonic Youth. Oh, I thought you guys were going to be all over this one. The MC5 is what Fred
Yes,
Sonic Smith.
thank you.
Yep.
I wasn't on
Yeah.
that. I wasn't
That
on
was
that
pretty bad,
episode.
guys.
That was a while ago. No, it's one of those things where I'm like, I know the name is so familiar, and I just couldn't do it. So
yes, Fred Sonic Smith of the MC5, and he probably is as well known for being Patti Smith's husband as well. And reggae artist Big Youth is where the youth comes from. So Kim Gordon kind of says that once they get the name Sonic Youth, the beginning of what they were looking to do sort of comes together, which is funny because Sonic Youth is always looking to do a lot of different things. So I just thought that was funny that Kim Gordon sort of says it congeals, like what we were looking for at that point. The band plays the aptly named Noise Fest in June 1981. One thing that I think is always interesting to look at is Sonic Youth was a pretty mature band by the time they break into the mainstream, right? Like by the time like the 90s roll around, Kim Gordon is in her late 30s, and Thurston Moore is heading toward his mid 30s, and as is Lee Ronaldo, right? So they're sort of veterans by the time they become established mainstream acts. So they're playing in these different things, and Lee Ronaldo comes in the picture because he is a member of Glenn Branca's Electric Guitar Ensemble. They see him play, and Thurston Moore is suitably impressed, calling them at one point the most ferocious guitar band I've ever seen in my life, and he decides he just needs to have Lee Ronaldo in Sonic Youth. And so that is where the Kim Gordon, Lee Ronaldo, Thurston Moore core comes in, and they bring in drummer Richard Edson. Richard Edson kind of is who they get after each band member just took turns playing the drums and decided, no, we'll bring a drummer in instead. Edson's there for a little while before he decides that he wants to pursue an acting career. They replace him with Bob Burt, who has an interesting history in Sonic Youth as well. Bob Burt is in the band. He has many, many issues in his first go-around with Thurston Moore, who basically, he constantly criticizes his drumming. Thurston Moore just doesn't feel like he's in the pocket, and they just part ways. So he's there. They bring in another drummer this time. Jim Sklavounos is the drummer. He's there for a couple months, and he quits. And and he was the drummer on Confusion is Sex, which is their first studio album. It's an EP, it turns into a studio album. So that's from 1983. He quits, and the group asks the aforementioned Burt to rejoin. And Burt, a little bit apprehensive as you may think, agrees. But this is my favorite. Agrees on the condition that he would not be fired again after the tour's conclusion. He's afraid they're just bringing him in to fill it out and not do it. But he ends up.
He was the one that Thurston Moore said wasn't in the pocket.
Correct.
Yeah.
So he ends up playing on the Kill Your Idols EP, and he actually ends up as the drummer on a couple of albums. Bad Moon Rising we didn't cover, but he's the drummer on that album as well. And really, like I said, the drummers just keep changing, and like Bert ends up leaving after Bad Moon Rising, which is a 1985 release, and the reason he gave for claiming that he wanted out of the group was that he claimed he was bored with playing Bad Moon Rising live in its entirety over the year. So he gets replaced by Steve Shelley, and Steve Shelley was a member of the fantastically named punk group The Crucifix, was his band, which he was in. I'd also like to point out that at one point Sonic Youth was considered to be part of a genre that the music press, most notably The Village Voice and Robert Christgau, who has a interesting relationship with Sonic Youth, called the Pigfucker label, was the name of the music. The other members of the group were Pussy Galore, the Butthole Surfers, and Big Black. So, I mean, that's a pretty fantastic trio right there of band names and different stuff like that. Christgau kind of was all over Sonic Youth early. He was not picking up what they were putting down. So Kim Gordon wrote him sort of it was described as like a aggressive letter, shall we say, to the Village Voice, and said that basically you're an asshole for pretty much not supporting local music. And Christgau said, just because you're local doesn't mean I have to support you. And Thurston Moore was also irritated, so he wrote a song called he had a song called Kill Your Idols, and he changed it to I Killed Christgau with My Big Fucking Dick, was the name of the song that he changed it out to. But luckily for you, they did sort out their differences, and actually Robert Christgau was a big fan of this album, Daydream Nation. So throughout the 80s, the early part of the 80s, I should say, they are proudly independent in their record labels. They're kind of always having fallouts with different record labels. They're on a record label called Neutral, one called Homestead Records. They eventually, though, signed with SST Records, and they were pretty pumped about that, and they released EVOL on that. They begin to get... Bad Moon Rising had gotten a little bit of press, enough that some major labels had looked into exploring signing them, but they decided to stay independent with SST. They do EVOL in 1986, which we covered. The music press starts to kind of become evangelized by them. Around this time, in between EVOL and Sister, they also have a sort of a separate band called Ciccone Youth, and yes, it is named after Madonna's surname. And they bring in Mike Watt of the Minutemen, and we talked about it because remember he was going through a depression, and they bring him in. And so basically Ciccone Youth is the members of Sonic Youth with Mike Watt built in. And
he wrote some songs on this, I saw.
He did, yeah, and it is definitely an experimental, even in the context of Sonic Youth, it's experimental even for them, the album. So it is not going to be for everyone. They do a cover of Into the Groove and Burnin' Up on both sides, which are very interesting takes. Sonic Youth always does a lot of very interesting covers. I think I shared with you one guys leading up to this. It was Superstar by the Carpenters, which I think is a pretty awesome cover that they do. But they did Robert Palmer's Addicted to Love on that. The second album that they do is called the Whitey album, that Ciccone Youth side project, and they covered Robert Palmer's Addicted to Love, and they recorded it in a karaoke booth. So so they were doing all kinds proudly art and indie rock at this point. In 87 they released Sister, which we covered. And that one, I don't think we talked about this during it, but it was I used the term loose concept album based on the life and works of Philip K. Dick, who you guys probably are somewhat familiar with science fiction. Definitely. Yep. The Sister title was the title of Philip K. Dick's fraternal twin, who died shortly after her birth, and it was sort of tied into that. That's the idea, right? The sister that the album was based on, right, was supposed to be the sister of Philip K. Dick. So kind of high concept there. Yeah. Sister sells 60,000 copies, which is kind of amazing, you know what I mean? Because that's not many at all, but it was considered to be a success. And it does end up in the top 20 of the Village Voice's critics poll. However, at around this time, the band becomes dissatisfied with SST. There's some royalty issues, some administrative issues, and they decide to change lanes, and they decide to go to Enigma Records for Daydream Nation, which was distributed by Capitol Records and partly owned by EMI, that record label. So they're not quite major label yet, but they're moving close to it. It wouldn't be till the next one where they're there. They released this a double LP. It is famously plagued by distribution issues. So there were many, many times where once this album starts to get word of mouth and end up in a lot of bests for the year, a lot of people found that they could not find the album in stores. And this, Sonic Youth, I don't think was looking to become rich and famous, right? But they did want to get heard, right, by people that wanted to hear them. And so that definitely frustrated them. And they actually, that was the last step before they end up on the major label DJC in late 1989, and that is where they will eventually release Goo from. So I do think it's interesting we covered Public Enemy because Goo famously features a collaboration between the band, most notably Kim Gordon and Chuck D, on Cool Thing, which is their highest charting song ever on the Billboard charts. So I thought that was interesting. There's a tie-in there for sure. And then the concept album tie-in. They had their own loose concept album with Sister. So there's a lot of other stuff we could talk about with Sonic Youth in terms of their influence and their sound. I'm probably going to weave in some of that, just so you know, some of the groups that Sonic Youth considers to be influences, as you might imagine. Velvet Underground, Stooges, Glenn Branca and his guitar ensemble, Patti Smith, Wire, Public Image Limited, and actually the band are massive fans of Joni Mitchell as well, all of them, and they have a song, Hey Joni, on this album as well that's after that. So I don't know if you can hear that one quite as much, but it's there. They also loved hardcore, and Thurston Moore did call Minor Threat, the DC hardcore band, the greatest live band I've ever seen at one point. So that gives you sort of a touch of what's going on. This also is the first album that starts to feature the classic one track sung by Lee Ronaldo track on every Sonic Youth album. So that becomes a hallmark of future Sonic Youth albums.
What track is that, John?
What track? Eric's Trip is the one sung by Lee Ronaldo. Yep, he has a very distinctive voice compared to Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon. So it does create that idea where there are now 3 singers in Sonic Youth instead of just the 2.
Did he sing Rain King as well? It sounds. I thought that sounded like him, the same person. I could be wrong.
You could be right. I think he does sing Rain King. Come to think of it, Matt. So yep. I'll look that up while you guys are giving your takes, but I think you may be right. So he might have done too. There are some albums that he does multiple songs, but a lot of times it's a one, and he'll write a song. A lot of times they're very distinctive in terms of their lyrical content and their sound too. So just something to keep in mind there. So anyway, I think people that have been listening to this podcast know that I am a noted Sonic Youth stan. You guys have been less than enthusiastic about Sonic Youth. We have been looking to when Sonic Youth starts to move a little bit into more accessibility. I would argue they probably creep a little bit more into it on each album. But Matt, you get the first take. What were your thoughts on this one?
Well, fellas, we finally have a Sonic Youth album I can get down to.
Me too.
It's almost like it's like if you took the 1988 equivalent of 45-year-old Matt and he had a meeting with Sonic Youth and said, "Listen, guys, you got some good ideas. You're totally creative and unique people. Can you throw some structure? Can you throw some melody? Can you do something here that's going to let me..."
And that is what they were trying for, to make this a little bit more accessible.
So thank you to 1988 Matt for having that conversation with Sonic Youth, because this album was like a very different listening experience for me than Sister or EVOL. This was way more inviting. This is way more interesting. This is way more pleasant. I liked every track on this record. I mean, Providence, I guess that's more of just it's not even really a song, but I'm okay with that. I know that's like Bugs always comes to mind from Pearl Jam's Vitalogy, or just these like 1 to 2 minute tracks that are just like throwaway stuff. People I've heard get really upset with stuff like, I don't care if you want to just throw in a thing about, it's like basically Providence is like a voice message for Thurston Moore, tell him to get it.
Piano.
Yeah, it's like get your shit together or whatever, whatever. I don't care. Like in an hour and 10 minute long album, that's fine. But no, this was I can see it now. I see why, and I don't know. At least with this record, this was I see why this is the highly ranked album, the one that and a reason why we're talking about it. But I was specifically I was able to see more into the guitar play between Ronaldo and Moore. I really thought that was kind of how they're playing off of each other was a very cool thing to experience on this record. There's plenty of noise on here still too. It doesn't mean that that there's not parts where it's not abrasive. I mean, there's definitely parts where it's kind of a little off-putting and jarring, but they can still come. This album proves that they can go delve into that area a little bit, but then bring it back into the structure that maybe they started the song with, longer songs like The Sprawl or Total Trash or Cross the Breeze. Like I like them exploring those avenues of going kind of, of taking an idea and fleshing it out and kind of going and then going a little bit off path and doing something a little different, then bringing it back. I mean, this is really kind of blending those two. The edginess is still very much there, but you're throwing on top of that a much more accessible entry point, for someone like me. And I love this stuff. I mean, this is indie rock all over the place. I see all kinds of bands doing stuff like this still today that I still like, that makes music more interesting, that draws you in, and it's distinct, and you kind of make it your own thing. So what I did with this record too was this is something I did like maybe an hour before the podcast. I just kind of, I found myself, because it is a long record, so I found myself like starting over again, not really fully getting through it, and then starting over again. So I think I listened to the first half more than I did the second half.
I accidentally listened to it on shuffle at one point walking.
Oh, really? Maybe that's an interesting way to do this record.
I was like, damn it.
So, but before we recorded, like I started somewhere around like Candle, and I just sat down with headphones, and I didn't have anything else going on. I didn't really look at the lyrics. I just wanted to. This to me was more important to like kind of get a little bit more sense of what was happening musically. I closed my eyes and I didn't listen to. I almost it reminded me of the way I used to listen to the cold listens in the original format when we only got one listen, and I would that's how I'd listen to those, because I knew I only get one shot at this. I need to divert all my attention to it, and so I like particularly like the trilogy, the last three songs, The Wonder, Hyperstation, and Eliminator Junior. Like I loved listening to those just on the headphone with only just me focusing on that, and that's kind of my epiphany here. I think I got to start listening to these albums maybe the first time, particularly the ones that I don't know as well, right? Because it doesn't. I don't think it would have done me any good to listen to Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction, with eyes closed, headphones. I don't need to do that. Like, I know pretty much every inch of that record. But, like, albums I don't know, maybe this is the way I need to go to really kind of... Because I multitask when I listen to records, and I'm doing other things, and I find myself, like, I just listen to a couple of songs or even like half of an album, and I go, what was that? You know what I mean? Like it was there, I was hearing it, I think I liked it, but I can't really speak about it. So, and that might be one of the reasons why I find myself, like, in the history of this podcast going, I listened to this record about 7 times, it's because that's what's happening, or I'll have it on at work and I'm kind of writing emails and I'm not really fully paying attention. Right. So I think I need to start changing my format of listening, because at least with this, and certainly with It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, I was getting much more out of it when it's quality, not quantity, I guess is what I'm saying. So, but this, I really like this record. This was this is checking off a lot of boxes. You're still getting kind of the monotone vocalization styles of all three singers, really, and that was something that was definitely off-putting for me in the previous records. But I didn't mind it nearly as much. I was very much okay with it, because underneath it all, couched and everything, was a song structure that I very much liked. I liked the drumming on this. Very interesting. really cool record, and I think maybe I'll go back and listen to this, like the whole thing with just the headphones, because I think that would be a very good experience here. So yeah, Sonic Youth, they did it finally. This is
about goddamn time you listened to it in the headphones, like I've been telling you for like all
John,
3 freaking albums.
Yeah,
so,
well, and I will say this: I don't need to listen to the because I knew that like most of this time I was listening to it not on headphones or just like kind of having it on in the background, and I could tell I liked it right away. So it's kind of like it's like finally hitting that Stevie Wonder album that I liked when we did Songs in the Key of Life, which also coincidentally enough was a double album too. Yeah. So so I finally got around to digging a Sonic Youth record. So this is the one that I should have, not necessarily Murray Street, but that one's that's for another time. But yeah, thumbs up, great album.
Yeah, this album does sound better on headphones too. As somebody who listened on shuffle on my iTunes iPhone headphones, it's better on the regular method. I am with you, Matt. This was the Sonic Youth album that I enjoyed. Also, this is their best album by far up to this point that for me at least. And the thing that I noticed about this is I think the length of the album and the songs really works to their advantage. I think they are able to explore their desire to have the feedback and the alternate tunings and kind of go full instrumental sometimes on like the last third of the song, or like in between, a long stretch in between the song. And I think that works well for their type of music. I'm glad they realized that Velvet Underground also made pop songs and like had some catchy stuff, and that they tried to mimic that to some extent, because I think there are some songs on here that do sound like Velvet Underground songs, specifically like Eric's Trip and others. John, the songs you picked for the montage and the opening were some of my favorite ones as well, so we're simpatico on that. Silver Rocket and Total Trash, I really kind of like the guitar licks. It's kind of punk rock. Silver Rocket's kind of a punk rock opening, but then it goes like full feedback and distortion, which was worked well, I think. They kind of, you get their uniqueness shines through on this album, but they're also, like you said, because of their desire or goal to be more accessible or more listenable,
inviting. It was way more inviting.
You kind of get the best of both worlds. Some songs are almost like pop songs at times, like Total Trash. They have kind of melodic things that come in, Cross the Breeze, even Teenage Riot, which is the opening track. I think I knew that song.
Is that a Rock Band song? Is that how we do that?
Oh,
it is in Rock Band. Yep.
Yeah, I think I knew that.
That's not how I know it, but it is in Rock Band. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But they have the guitar. The guitar works really well on that track, and then it speeds up, and I don't know. That's kind of like the sweet spot, I think, in terms of what their sound or what I want from them. It's kind of the best of both worlds. So, it's pretty great. Almost every, there's parts of like almost every song that I liked. There was, with the even something like Hey Joni, I really like the chorus on that. Candle, which they slowed down, but I like that as well. Hold on one second. I thought I was going to sneeze. Sorry.
Dramatic pause.
I know. And I agree, Matt. The rhythm section is really on point on this album. That they popped out. By the time I got to Rain King, I was like, oh, the drumming is really good on this album. And
it's like a driving kind of just like it's finding grooves. I think that's what they're doing too. It's not always melody. It's just we got a groove. We're in this groove here. We're going to play with this a little bit, and I really liked it when they did that.
Yeah. And that's kind of like post-punk in a way when they find those grooves that work for me. I'm with you. I find some of their vocal delivery a little annoying at times. Kim Gordon, especially on this album, I didn't like when I liked her on previous albums. I don't know. Something about the monotone their monotone delivery doesn't really work for me. It's like too shoegazy or grungy for me. Too disaffected, I guess, would be for me. But musically, yeah, this album is solid, and it is a commitment, being an hour and 10 minutes, but I was able to listen to it multiple times and got something out of it each time. So thumbs up for me on this one.
I can officially retire from the podcast now because you guys have finally begun to listen to music like how I do.
I've always listened on headphones.
I know, I joke. I took great joy in the fact that you guys put on the headphones and listened to this and kind of immersed in it a little bit, because I do feel it gives you the most honest listen on types of music like this. You don't have to love it, but I feel that it's there. And I mean, I'm not surprised that you guys like this album. I would have been surprised if you guys didn't. And I've sort of been hinting at the fact that, like, they're going to move in a direction you guys like a lot more, because it's going to stay here for a couple albums. If anything, it's going to get more accessible. But yeah, I mean, this album is so fucking good. Like, it's one of the best alternative indie rock, whatever you want to call, albums that's ever made. Teenage Riot is almost a perfect song. It starts slow. The guitar, I love the guitar riff and the bringing it back to the repetition, but then the feedback being layered all over it. Mm-hmm. I don't have any problem at all with the lyric. I think that you have to sing this way over this. It's almost impossible for me to think of what lyrics would sound like if you didn't sing with them in that way on this album. But Silver Rocket has a great guitar. It's almost like Sonic Youth, like, as a reminder, we can really play the freaking guitar, and we're going to play it more streamlined just in case you think we can't, right? We'll write like a straight ahead awesome guitar riff that follows up another awesome guitar riff on Teenage Riot, but in a more traditional rock way. Yeah. And then I love the sprawl because you get like full Kim Gordon effect, which I love, like that she starts the song off with, to the extent that I wear skirts and cheap nylon slips, I've gone native, which makes me laugh every time I hear it, because it's like such a fucking cool kid New York line right there. And, you know, there's another part where she's like, fuck you, are you for sale? Does fuck you sound simple enough? Which makes me laugh when I hear it and stuff. So I Kissability makes me laugh too, because it's basically about becoming a star, and it's very much a commentary. You could see why, like, Courtney Love loves Kim Gordon so much, right? But I think the revelation this album, you guys have mentioned to it, but the step up even more is Steve Shelley is a really, really, really good rock drummer. And I love him as a drummer. I think he's one of the more underrated drummers of all. Like, this is kind of like your first taste of him in Sonic Youth. So it's interesting that you guys both noticed him pretty quickly. I think his part of the sound of Sonic Youth is so important because as much as this is a guitar band, right? Just his drumming just pops through the noise and the feedback and the guitar at different points. And at times, you know, we talked about how Thurston Moore was so angry at Bert for not being in the pocket, but there are times where, I mean, Steve Shelley goes deeply in the pocket, but then he also goes chaotic and he goes free. He's just so, he has such dexterity in the way he plays. And I love the fact that he can be so forceful at times, but then, you know, if he needs to be subtle, he could play that role as well. I also should mention, like, Kim Gordon's progress as a bass player from the two albums we've covered to this album is pretty remarkable too. I don't know if you guys noticed that as well, but the bass lines are considerably more clearly defined on this album and really accentuate the rhythm section. The rhythm section is much more present on this album than it was in Sister and Evil. I love the mix of this album, how everything's put together. I think it's a joy to listen to on headphones, even more so than noise rock is for me to begin with. It's a pleasant listen for me. To me, this album does not ever feel 70 minutes long. And that's why I almost don't process it as a double album sometimes, because it doesn't really have two sides in a way that you're like, oh, that's side one and side two. And it doesn't play like a double album because it doesn't feel 70 minutes long, at least to me. And I think it's what you guys mentioned, that part of their sound is accentuated by the length. And I like Matt, it's interesting that you listened to the Hyperstation Eliminator Junior Eric's Trip piece, because they're clearly designed to kind of be listened to together, right, as like a piece of music to some degree.
Yeah.
And you can kind of see the progression of the track, almost like a prog rock track, in the sense that there's remember when we did the prog rock, right? They gave the different parts of the songs names,
in
right?
The same title.
So I think it's kind of like a little bit of an homage to that type of way of putting songs together. But I mean,
yeah, it's listed as one track on Wikipedia as trilogy, and then A, B, C, which on Spotify it was A, B, X or something like that.
Yeah. Which is something that like
yeah.
Yes would do. Yeah. I mean, I knew it as ABC because I had the CD, and I think I
also thought it was funny.
Set tape is
ABZ.
On Spotify said album version. I'm like, what the hell else version? What am I gonna get? Like, why is it all say
Vinyl?
album version? I wonder what the other is. It yeah, I don't know. It just didn't give me other choice. But
well, it's like album version could be the original, right? And then there's the remastered
live version.
the
They
live
come to your
version.
house.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be that. So, but yeah, I mean, what else could I say about? I've talked about Sonic Youth quite a bit in other episodes and why I love them. I think they're like one of the coolest bands, both image wise and sound wise. I'm always digging what they're picking up in terms of their experimentation. I love the fact that they can be flat out weird and abrasive, and then suddenly surprise you by being very pretty and almost like a massive storm followed by the calm after the storm, and they can do both in the same song at different times.
Yeah.
And when you beef up this version of Sonic Youth, when you've got Kim Gordon pretty much having established herself as a bass player here, and you're entering into that period where there's always great guitar interplay between Ronaldo and Thurston Moore, but you're really starting to be able to differentiate the parts instead of them sort of bleeding together. And then Steve Shelley in the drums is the ultimate secret weapon that's added in here, because he almost completes the circle with their sound. I mean, there's not much bad I could say about this album, guys. This goes right into my favorite albums of the 80s for sure. It's just going to be how high up it goes for me. And yeah, it hits all of my buttons. And also, you absolutely can hear the influence in terms of where alternative rock is going. In the early 90s for sure, when it gets harsher, you know what I mean, and heavier in the mainstream, and a lot of bands cross over where you're like, how the hell did this band become a mainstream band, right? And this is sort of the chaser to that sound. We haven't done the Pixies yet either, but they're the other chaser that's coming, right? That's gonna lead the way. So
I mean, they are big enough that they got on The Simpsons. So
Sonic Youth,
yeah, or Homer Palooza.
yes,
yes.
yeah.
Is this your favorite Sonic Youth album, John? Or do you have?
Oh boy, it changes. It changes all the time. It's
whatever the last one he listened to is, Josh.
No, that's not true. There's ones that I don't know if there's any Sonic Youth albums I don't like. There's ones that I can appreciate what they were going for, but it doesn't hit as much with me. I mean, it is very hard to not pick Daydream Nation, but I do love me. I do love Goo, the album that's coming up afterwards. I like Sister a lot. Dirty has some of my favorite tracks of theirs. I love Rather Ripped. I love the last album they made, The Eternal. There's a bunch, and there's always stuff on each of their albums that I like. New York City Ghost and Flowers is an album that's sort of polarizing for them too, that I like, but I know others don't. So Sonic Nurse, I won't run every album, but like there's different ones that depending on the day. But this one for most people is the Sonic Youth album that you go to first, and I totally get it. But I think we got to listen to all of them, guys, and then afterwards you can weigh in as well, because we're entering a different period of Sonic Youth that I think is going to resonate more with you guys. So,
well, I will say I'm glad we listened to those other two albums, because I think I appreciate this album more as a result, and kind of their change in sound. So from that aspect, it's good.
Yeah, I was just
I think
like,
if you were
it was
just
like
thrown in, it would not be as impactful least
I don't. Well, yeah, that might be true. I still would have liked it a lot, but it was almost like a pressure valve was being released. I was like, finally, or like when when like you're going on a plane and your ears popping and you're like, crap, like it's like this annoying thing, and then like it releases, you're like, like it's kind of like that. I was like I was worried. I was like, man, Public Enemy and Sonic Youth at the same. This is gonna be a rough week, but I was pleasantly surprised with both, but particularly this one.
It's funny you said that. I'm surprised. I was more surprised that you came around on the Public Enemy album, Matt, because I had a good feeling that you were gonna come around to it, and I don't want to telegraph too much, but the next couple, it's gonna be interesting to see what you guys think of those. So,
yeah, I really don't think, I don't know, the Public Enemy I might not have come around to if I didn't listen to it the way I did yesterday, because I definitely had way more cogent thoughts on my relationship with that record, but as a result of that, than I would have otherwise. So I'm glad I did that.
And I would strongly urge you guys both to I know it's hard with lives and stuff that's going on, and so I don't want to sound preachy or scoldy that way, but I do always listen at least one time to these albums in a thing where it is the primary thing that I'm doing on headphones. And I do think that's the reason, Matt, why sometimes I don't have to listen to it more than twice, Matt, because both listens are pretty thorough. And I am not the type of guy that can put on an album in a car or what. I can't multitask. I can't, I can't, let me put it this way. I can't multitask for something I want to talk about on a podcast. I won't understand it that way.
It is hard.
I can if I'm listening. Yes. And so, I'd have nothing if I did it. So it's an essential for me to be able to do it, because that is how I'm able to, my usual method is I listen to an album one time in that format, just sort of uncluttered listening, usually my first listen. And then my second listen is the one where I jot down some notes as I'm listening. So it's more of an active listen, I'd say.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my process, if you will. And then sometimes if I'm like, I can't quite figure out how I feel about this album, that's when it will get the third listen along the way. Mm-hmm. So, yep. So, yeah, for me, real high thumbs up. I mean, I love this album.